So let's begin to kind of understand. I'll preface this by saying what you've probably seen with a lot of your knowledge of Grasshopper thus far, if you have any, is that there's a lot of dynamic patterning. And dynamic patterning is kind of like saying, I want to take an attractor point and I want everything that's really close to the attractor point be really small, and then all of the circles or squares or openings or whatever that's far away from it are going to be really large, and everything in between scales from small to large, right? That's what I would call dynamic patterning, but it also, functions off of data input that says, like you can create a cull pattern that, randomly reduces or deletes certain panels or something like that. So all of those things are considered dynamic patterning because it patterns very regular and regimented systems based on some kind of data input. Okay, does that make sense to you guys? If it doesn't, it will in a second. Because I'm not going to do a lot of dynamic patterning, but I'm going to give you a basic understanding of it. And while I've done tons of dynamic patterning in the past, it's not really helpful until you understand how to deconstruct everything and reconstruct it. So this is going to be a recurring theme here in the class: deconstruct, reconstruct, deconstruct, reconstruct. And I've got a little diagram I'll draw for you in a little while. But to start off, let's start to create a grid, right? Because the assignment, if you recall, is a grid. It's a grid that functions off of points and lines and planes, right? Because that's how you create grids. You start with a dot, draw a line, and then you end it, and then you draw 4 more lines, and you've got a surface, right? So those are our 3 components. But let's get started with it, okay? So we want to create a grid, and that grid is going to be located under the Vector tab and under the Grid panel. So if you click on the little, black bar at the bottom, it'll expand it into a couple of different types of grids that you can make. So, I'll open up some, exploration time to try out some of these other grids, but to start off, I'm going to work off of the square grid, right? Because that's what we're working with. I'll give you an option, actually. So, your option is to either do a square or rectangular grid for now. Okay, so I'll drop square in for now, and I'll show you the relationship of the rectangular grid. All right, so for visibility's sake, I have 2 grids. Those 2 grids, if I click on them, are coincident right now. So in the top view, I've got the green grid that's really small right there, and if I select this one, it's a green grid that's really big. Okay, so if you want to see one element versus another, you have to hide those elements. And this is very, very important to understand, because when you get 10 steps down the road, technically all of the geometry that you created before it still exists. You just don't want to see it. Okay, so if you create a sphere, then you need to hide that once you've subdivided that sphere into panels. Then if you delete some of those panels, you need to hide the original sphere so that you can only see the remaining panels, right? All that geometry still exists, you just need to hide it. So if I want to see my square grid underneath of this, I right-click on the node for the rectangular grid, and I turn off preview. Okay, it shows as dark gray, and this one shows as a light gray. That means that that is visible. So if I select this, I can't see it. Okay, I have to right-click it and turn preview back on to see it. Okay, so the way that you would turn off multiple elements at once, which I guarantee you eventually you're going to want to do, you select them all. And I don't think I have to explain to you guys, because you know Rhino, the selection methods. If you right to left select, it's going to select everything that it touches. And if you left to right select, it'll only select the elements that are fully encompassed, right? You guys all know about that by now, I think. If you don't, I just told you. So if you select both of them and you want to hide both at once, the difficult thing is you would think if you right click and they're both selected and you turn off preview that it's going to hide both of them. Well, it doesn't. It only hides one. So what you have to do, it only hides the one that you right-clicked, I should say. So what you have to do is middle mouse click, which brings up a shortcut menu like this. And your hide options are right here. So you can turn them both off by going to that little, blindfolded guy on the top right. Okay? So you'll find that I don't typically use the shortcut menu very much. I don't find shortcut menus to be all that useful in most cases. You might as well just type it in or have a button that does it somewhere on the list. Okay, so that's just my personal opinion. You can modify it and play around with it if you want. So let me turn that off. So I'll just work with a rectangle now to show you kind of how it operates. And you'll notice here right off the bat that the square and the rectangle have different inputs. And most notably, the rectangle has one extra input, but it doesn't have an S. Okay, so here's how the square works. Everything needs a base plane. Okay, all of your geometry is going to have some sort of base plane for the most part. And then it'll have a size, and then it'll have the properties. So the square just has a size, right? Because the x and the y direction are going to be the same because it's square. And then it'll have the actual the count. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word count. It's already that time of night. So it has the count here, and the count is going to say how many in the x direction, how many in the y direction, right? Pretty simple to understand. And all of those can either be static numbers or dynamic numbers, right? So I can drop in, for the size, I want to say 0 is less than 25 is less than 50, say. I'm just going to start with that, and I'll plug that in. And then for the count, I'm going to say 0 is less than 4 is less than, say, 5. All right, so before I plug anything into the y, I want to start the discussion about plugging things in and the different ways that you can plug things in. So outputs are pretty dynamic because you can pull multiple outputs off of a single entity, right, or a single node. For a square, if I want exactly the same number of rows as I want columns, I can just use the same slider and plug that into y. So all I have to do is just plug another wire into it. Clear enough? Oh, sorry. I'm working off the square, but what I want to work off of eventually is that, but I'll get there. So let me show you this. All right. So I've got this. It's sized to 25. Oh, that means it's really big. All right. So there we go. 25. I can change the number here in both directions by having them match. Okay, so if I want 4 grid cells on both ways, that's how that works. Okay, if I want to, and I can hide that and go back to the rectangle and show this rectangle here. So for the rectangle, because the sides are not the same, it's going to ask you for a size in the x direction, size in the y direction, count in the x direction, count in the y direction, right? So I can copy and paste both of these down. And I want my size in the x direction to be 25. I'll copy and paste, and size in the y direction, it's going to start at 50 or 40, something. And then the count, I'm going to leave the same, 4 and 4. Okay? So pretty simple. But let's say you make a mistake and you want 2 different grids or something like that, and you want to plug in a different number, or you have, let's say I have a 10 up here that I want to reference into it. So I can either override that value, or I can add in another value, or I can disconnect it. The distinction here is that with a grid, you can only input one value, and it'll kind of tell you whether or not it's only going to take one value, and you'll eventually get to learn which types of nodes will request more. So if I want to change this to a 12 from up here, I can just pull a wire and drop it over top of that 25, and it will automatically disconnect it and override it with the new one. Okay, so wire management. Wire management is very important when you get down the line here, and I'll explain more of that too. Wire management, it's also very important for like your computer at home. Just get in the practice of being clean. That's one way. But if I want to go back to the other one and I don't want to do the whole dragging and overriding thing, which usually is the way you want to go, but if you just want to disconnect it, just right-click on the node. Whoops. Right-click on the input of the node, go to disconnect, and it'll give you a list. Right now there's only one option, and I can just click that and say I want to disconnect this slider. It highlights it red, and then you disconnect it. But if you have a bunch of inputs, it's going to give you a list of them, and you can hover over, and it'll highlight in red, you know, which one you're about to disconnect. Okay, so that's very much like Rhino. If you have multiple entities that you're trying to select, it gives you a little selection menu, and it'll highlight them in yellow. Very much like Rhino. Yes?
Can you only do it from that node, or can you do it from the slider?
You can do it from the, well, yeah, I think you can. Yeah. No. Wait. Maybe not a slider, but you can from like here, I think. Yeah. So if I have, let's say I've got some spheres or something, or that. I'll explain part of this later too. Disconnect from the output side. As long as it's an eligible output that has a connection that you can disconnect from there, you can do it that way. I think that's essentially what you were asking, right? Doesn't seem like I can do it from a slider because I don't actually have an element there, like an output type. It's just either the wire or the slider value, it seems. Does that make sense? Yeah. Alrighty. So I am going to function off of the square grid. And my numerical values are going to be, so, oh, let me check my units here. So I'm going back into Rhino to double check my units. I want to make sure I'm in feet, which I am. You should probably do the same right about now. Make sure you're working in feet. So right here, my grid is essentially going to be, well, that's only 12. I want 25. All right. So it's each one of these grid cells. That's the definition, right? So the size here is asking you for the size of grid cell, which means that each one of those grid cells is actually 25 feet long. And I've got 4 of them, which means that my whole grid is 100 feet long, right? So kind of getting that now? So let's get into that whole idea of deconstruct, reconstruct, deconstruct, reconstruct. It's very, very important. Actually, I should probably stop this video right about now. It's like 12 minutes long. All right, I'll stop it. Then we'll get into that. Questions? All right.